In this lesson, we'll take a look at the ray trace shadow type found in 3ds Max. Alright, so to demonstrate this, we're just going to start by dropping in a new light. So let's go to our Create menu, Create Lights, make sure that we are going to create a standard light. And in my case, just as a point of personal preference, whenever I know I'm going to create any kind of ray trace shadows inside of Mental Ray, I always make it a point to use the Mental Ray Area type lights. So either a Mental Ray Area Omni or a Mental Ray Area Spot. So in my case, I'm just going to use the Mental Ray Area Spot, and we'll talk a little bit more about why this is a better choice to use here in just a moment. So really it draws out and it behaves exactly the same way as the standard spotlight. So just click and draw this out. Now if we take a look over in the Modify tab, you'll notice that with this particular light type, this Mental Ray Area, you'll notice that shadows are automatically turned on and it's automatically set to use ray trace shadows. So now, whenever I render this, again, pressing Shift-Q on my keyboard, I am rendering this out using Mental Ray. And you can see that right away we're actually getting some pretty good results. So these ray trace shadows actually don't rely on that same kind of a pixel-based map that the shadow maps relied on from our previous lesson. So you can see that right out of the box we start to get some really nice crisp shadows, really no pixelization or anything like that. None of the same problems that we had previously with the shadow map types. So really the main drawback to using these ray trace shadows is that while they are much more accurate and much more realistic, the drawback is that they do take quite a bit longer to render compared to the shadow types. Now when it comes to actually rendering any kind of a soft shadow, there are a couple of things that we need to keep in mind. If we are going to be rendering this inside of Mental Ray, we do need to make sure that we are using the ray trace shadows. All of these other shadow types, the advanced ray trace, area shadows, and shadow map, none of these three types are compatible with the Mental Ray renderer. So if we turn this on to ray trace shadows, and again making sure that we are using the Mental Ray Area light type, if we scroll down, we should have access to the area light parameters. So this is how we can start to get some soft shadows inside of Mental Ray. So expand this area light rollout, and we can now start to adjust the height and width of this. So what this will start to do is now, instead of making it appear as if though our light is emitting from one very tiny point in space, we can start to adjust the height and width of this area. And you can see as I start to adjust this, you can start to see this little blue manipulator show up as long as I'm adjusting this spinner. So what this will do is try to simulate the effect of light now coming from a larger area. Alright, so again, if I just press the G key on my keyboard to try to hide my grid, there we are. Now that becomes a little bit easier to see this area that the light will be emitted from, hence the name Area Light. Okay, so now with our area adjusted up to a larger size, let's now take another render of this, again pressing Shift-Q on my keyboard. Alright, and now you can start to see that these ray trace shadows start to behave in a much more physically accurate way, where now that we've started to introduce a little bit larger area into this, we can now start to see where these portions of our scene that are very close to our shadow casting objects are going to be really nice and sharp. But as we start to get further and further away from the actual source of our shadows, you can see that our shadows will start to get softer and softer, exactly as they should in real life. So the actual size and the amount of blurriness that you get in your shadows does depend on the actual size of your area. So if we wanted these shadows to be a little bit sharper, all we have to do is start to bring this actual size of our area down to a little bit smaller size. And now because our light is coming from a smaller area, we'll start to get some sharper shadows. Alright, and you can see now that our shadows do have some blurriness to them, but really not nearly as much as what we had before. Alright, now looking at our ray trace shadows, you can start to see just a very faint amount of noise around the outer portions of these shadows, and these start to happen as we start to introduce more of these soft kind of area type shadows. So if we want to adjust the amount of noise that we see in here, this is done through the samples. So right now this is set up to a relatively high value, so horizontal and vertical samples. Now if we start to back this down to a much lower number, we should start to get a much more pronounced noise pattern. And you can see that once the render completes, that we do have a lot more noise in our render, But the flip side is that our renders can happen much, much faster with this lower sampling noise. So really this becomes kind of a balancing act of finding the right mixture between speed and quality whenever adjusting these. Usually a good rule of thumb would be to actually start with a very low value and then gradually start to increase these values until you find something that is, like I said, the good mix between quality and speed that you're looking for. Alright, now one last thing that I want to talk about before we wrap up this lesson is relation to shadows whenever working with these spotlights as well as the directional lights in 3ds Max. So at the moment you'll see that my shadows are looking really just about as they should. But if you recall from one of our earlier lessons, you'll notice that the directional light does have an attribute in here for the overshoot, and the spotlight has this as well. So when we turn on the overshoot option, what this will start to do is now illuminate things that fall outside of our cone of light. Alright, so when it comes to using both the directional lights and the spotlights, this is a way of making sure that our entire scene does get illuminated. Now, whenever it comes to working with shadows, we start to run into a little bit of a problem here. So, just to demonstrate this, if I were to come in, and let's take this spot, and let's actually move this over. So I'm going to try to grab this target for the spot. There we are. And pull back, and actually adjust this cone a little bit to where this torus knot is actually only partially inside this cone of light. So let's go back and re-render this, and we should start to see the issue that we're trying to point out here. And if we look, we can actually see exactly what I was trying to point out. So for the most part, we do have some nice illumination. But if you look right in this area, you can start to see this really harsh edge. So what's happening is that while we are providing illumination to the entire scene, thanks to this overshoot option, the areas that will only receive shadows are still limited to being inside of this cone. So any objects or any portions of our scene that fall outside of this cone of light will still not receive any kind of shadows from this point on, even though there will still be illumination on that side. Alright, so anytime we're going to be using a spotlight or a directional light that has this overshoot option turned on, we just need to make sure that all of the objects that we want to receive shadows do fall inside of this cone of light. So, again, let's just grab this spot. Alright, and in the spotlight parameters rollout, let's just go ahead and take this field and expand this, so that way this outer field will go ahead and make sure it does encompass the entire area that we want to receive shadows. And now re-render this. You can see that as long as our object does fall completely inside of that cone of light, we won't wind up with any of the clipping or trimming off of our shadows that we had just a moment ago. Alright, so that's a look at the ray trace shadow type and how we can start to control that in getting some very realistic, physically accurate shadows inside of 3ds Max.